Russ Baker is the kind of investigative journalist we want to help publicize on this program. His whowhatwhy.com website, which he founded in 2005, has taken a probing look at what the legendary Peter Dale Scott has called deep politics. Who, What, Why digs below the surface headlines to explain what is really going on. This is hard to do, if for no other reason than the fact that such reporting will run counter to narratives being spun by various powers that be. We were privileged to speak to Russ some years back, and over the years we have often quoted from the stories he brings before the public. 3 recent pieces caught our attention. The first concerned the refugee crisis currently raging in Europe over the mainly Syrian population fleeing their homeland. Russ reviewed what the media has largely ignored, which is how this crisis came to be. Also, a story from a book written by an American Foreign Service worker about bizarre goings-on in Saudi Arabia in the 80s. Extremists getting visas they shouldn't have, thanks to our intelligence community. And finally, the still unexplained tale of a Saudi family who fled from Florida right after 9/11. There's so much more we could and should talk about, but we're grateful that Russ Baker is joining us at all, for he is a busy man. We're pleased to be able to say welcome back to Radio Parallax, Russ Baker.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be here.
Russ, the story about the Syrian refugees could be said to start back probably to the time of Russia's war in Afghanistan. It can also be seen as being interwoven with this strange tale about Saudi visas. Can you take us back to the 80s and describe how some bright sparks got the idea of using jihadists in U.S. foreign policy?
Right. In fact, what I might do is just sort of start from the present and then go back, because I think it's important. Before we start discussing history, a lot of people tune out when you talk about history. They don't fully understand how important it is to know the backstory to where we are, the fork in the road where we are. How did we get here? And so the fork in the road is all of these things are going on in the world. The huge numbers of refugees are swamping Europe. There's pressure on other places to some extent also to take them, and there's a lot of debate about who should take them and so forth, and there's very little discussion about why these people even are refugees, what has caused this, and
right.
That in itself is just, it's just a tragedy that there's very little discussion of that. But of course, if we look at any of these other things like the situation in the Ukraine or almost any other flashpoint in the world, there's always a backstory. And the reason I started whowhatwhy.org is because I was so frustrated with the kind of places I was working for, more traditional news organizations that treated the backstory as almost, something you might, if you had time, you might explain, but you really often wouldn't even bother. And so all of these things that you're bringing up actually are very closely related, as is the backstory to the creation of the whole sort of jihad movement, the creation of Al-Qaeda, and then of ISIS. All of these things go back to very, very similar things. And what those things are and what they all have in common, which is almost never discussed, is that foreign policy, by and large, specifically American foreign policy, but also foreign policy of really most, if not all countries, is self-interest. Mm-hmm. And self-interest is actually not even the right term, because the policies are not necessarily in the interests of the people of those countries so much as they're in the interests of certain elements that have outsized influence and power within that society. And that gets us to another element you raised, which is Peter Dale Scott and his analysis of deep politics. I was just reading the other day some excerpts from one of my favorite writers, C. Wright Mills, W-R-I-G-H-T, initial C. Wright Mills, the sociologist who wrote some very important books, including one where he talked about the power elite. And this is really dealing with the fact that the policy of the United States is largely dictated by those who have a lot of money, who control companies and markets and have a great interest in resources and the movement of them and markets and cheap labor throughout the world. And so this is the backstory to all of these situations. And so when we look at Syria, we look at a situation where Why are those people fleeing? Well, they're fleeing because there's a war there. And why is there a war there? Well, there's a war there because the United States and its allies played a very significant role in encouraging and then helping those who created a rebellion against the central government. Now, that's not to debate the merits of that central government under Bashar al-Assad, but to note that, in fact, we wouldn't have these refugees if it were not for this uprising largely stoked by the West. You have a comparable situation in the Ukraine. You have a comparable situation in so many places. The situation with ISIS, where that came out of Iraq. The Iraq invasion, we all know now, was sold to us as a bill of goods. We were not told the real reason that we were going in there. And so as we track back, we see the same thing. Now with the Saudi story, and if we have time, I'm happy to go into each of these in much more detail. The Saudi story is a story we did at whowhatwhy.org about the people we are told hijacked the planes on 9/11, and evidence we saw linking those suspects to the Saudi royal family pretty directly, I would say, astonishingly directly. And then this other story you mentioned that we've done recently, which are excerpts from a book by a former U.S. consul in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and he tells his story of how, going way back to the late 70s, early 80s period, he was pressured to admit to allow a whole bunch of people from Saudi Arabia to give them visas to go to the United States, even though he didn't believe their stories. He found it suspicious. He didn't trust where they were really going and what they were planning to do. And, of course, it was his job, ostensibly, as a consul to be suspicious and to check these things out and to make tough decisions on who he would and would not admit. And yet, as Michael Springman tells in his book, which we excerpt in several pieces on whowhatwhy.org, he was under pressure from the CIA people working in the embassy, and he stresses just how many there were, what a large percentage of the total staff were, in fact, not real diplomatic people, not real people from Foreign Service Corps, but people working in covert intelligence activities. And what he was witnessing, he didn't realize it at the time, was the creation of a pipeline to create the jihad, to create the army that would travel eventually to Afghanistan with the goal of swamping the Soviets and creating a morass for them that they couldn't get out of. And this, of course, started with people like Zbigniew Brzezinski under Carter, continued through the Reagan and Bush years. And again, not so much discussing the pros and cons of that strategy, but the consequences of it were that the United States effectively built this army that eventually was turned against it. And so what you see, Doug, in case after case, from the creation of what later became Al-Qaeda, the creation of what later became ISIS, the creation of what later became this tremendous flow of refugees, in every case we see a policy of self-interest by certain members of American and other Western elites, and then we see tremendous miscalculations on the part of their allies in the U.S. government, where we face sort of constant disaster. And then these disasters, what's so interesting is that these disasters then become the justification for these needed various wars, the war on terror, the war on this, the war on that. And, of course, those then require us to turn over more of our own personal assets in the form of funding and also our personal freedoms, as we're told that there are all of these threats, and we therefore need to give up our freedom and allow the government to surveil us and to watch us and to check us and to do all of these things because of these so-called threats that endanger us. And
right.
The bottom line of all of this is that we are the suckers. We are made to constantly be a kind of a victim in one situation after another, to say nothing of all of these people under these horrific circumstances all over the world who face much, much worse penalties than we ever do. But cumulatively, what you're seeing is the vast majority of the people really in the world suffering while a very small number of people gain.
Russ, I want to mention that, just to talk about that 1980s visa story, what we're talking about really here is how the likes of Osama bin Laden got hooked up with CIA training. And that's a rather important point.
Oh, it absolutely is. And then as you go forward, you understand, you start wanting to look at the relationship between Osama bin Laden's family and the Saudi royal family. And then you begin looking at the relationship of the Saudi royal family and parts of the bin Laden family and important American elites. And, my book, Family of Secrets, which is a book about the Bush dynasty, we see the very close relationship between the Bush family and their allies with the Saudis. And we even see all these strange things, like on the morning of 9/11, that we see their consigliere, James Baker, and George H.W. Bush, and so forth. The day of 9/11, when we see the attacks purportedly carried out principally by Saudis, we see them gathering with members of people involved with the Carlyle Group, these kinds of large corporate organizations, and some of their important investors, which include people from the bin Laden family. Now,
yeah.
Of course, they said that they had long been estranged from Osama, but nonetheless, there were all kinds of factions in that family, and we see all of these fascinating links. And then, of course, the backstory to how the Bush group and their allies cut a deal with the Saudi royal family long, long ago, decades ago, covered extensively in my book, Family of Secrets, about how they agreed to basically protect the Saudi royals, who are the same kind of bloodthirsty dictators that the U.S. seems to want to get rid of everywhere else, and to agree to protect them and keep them in power in return for some of the loot, if you will.
Yeah, my understanding, Russ, is dating back to that siege of the holy sites in Mecca back in the late 70s, that a deal was really struck between the Saudi royals and the more rabid among the fundamentalists that, you stay out of the kingdom and we will help fund your efforts around the rest of the world, which I think has continued to the present time.
Yes, and of course that may suggest what we're seeing with that story, which we did a few years ago and recently republished on Who, What, Why, about the curious relationship between the Saudi royal family via an important Saudi family living in Sarasota, Florida, and Mohammed Atta and Ziad Jarrah and some of the other alleged 9/11 hijackers.
Tell that story. You've been on the story. Michael Moore's mentioned it, Greg Palast and others, but you really stayed on it and have a recent piece on it. Update where we are on this story.
Yeah, and let me clarify, because a lot of this is conflated. Our story is not the same story as some of these other people have mentioned. We've all looked at pieces of the same issue, which is what exactly is, if any, the Saudi government or Saudi royal family role in 9/11. Now, Michael Moore played a very significant role, in particular, in bringing that to the public attention by focusing on the way in which prominent Saudis were rushed out of the United States right after 9/11, instead of being interrogated or just held as anybody was in the United States. They were given a special opportunity to leave while nobody else could fly. And that was a very important story that Michael Moore did. But I want to emphasize that our story is a completely different story. And I think, I hope it's not too self-serving to say that I think our story is more important, because we all knew that story. Michael Moore didn't have an exclusive. That was something that was out there, was known, that all these people had been allowed to fly. The story that we developed, and I want to credit Tony Summers and Dan Christensen, two fellows who did the initial story from Florida. What they found was that an affluent Saudi family living in the Sarasota area had left their home days before 9/11, as opposed to those planes which left after 9/11. This is a family leaving shortly before 9/11. And so we see them leaving the Sarasota area somewhere in the period of a week or two prior to 9/11, but leaving in great haste. And the neighbors simply noticed that their neighbors had left, noticed that they were Saudi. Now, that could mean nothing at all, of course. But then when investigators were able to enter the house, they discovered that the family had fled in great haste, that